Differentiating Objective and Subjective Countertransference by Paul Geltner. Part 3. Subjective countertransference. Subjective countertransference are chose elements of the countertransference that are primarily a product of the analyst's life story and do not contain any information about the patient. It can be manifested in 3 ways. 1. Subjective countertransference feelings, in which the analyst has feelings with or about the patient that are unrelated to the patient's life story. 2. Subjective misinterpretations of feelings that are objectively induced. 3. The inability to tolerate feelings, whether they are objective or subjective, that interfere with the analyst's ability to relate to the patient therapeutically. Subjective countertransference feelings. Thus far, I have argued that every effort should be made to determine whether any countertransference that the analyst experiences is objective or contains objective elements, and that this should be the analyst's initial working assumption in analyzing the countertransference. Eventually, after the countertransference has passed through this epistemological sieve, some elements will remain that have no meaningful relationship to the patient's life story. These are the subjective dimensions of the countertransference. They have been stimulated by emotional contact with the patient, but are not otherwise related to her. These are the truly subjective countertransference feelings. These feelings are always incongruent with the content, but there is rarely anything in the raw experience of a feeling that distinguishes it as subjective. Just as the objectivity of a countertransference becomes visible when it is placed in the context of the patient's life story, subjective countertransference feelings often become visible when they are placed in the context of the analyst's life history, or more narrowly within the context of the analyst's feelings about her caseload as a whole. Objective countertransference is an individualized response to a particular patient, and objective inductions should vary considerably from patient to patient. To some extent, this variability will be constrained by the fact that many patients have the same kinds of problems. If most of the analyst's patients are anaclitic depressives, she is more likely to experience monochrome hopelessness more frequently than if her practice were liberally sprinkled with borderlines, narcissists, bipolars, and melancholic depressives. But even with similar patients, and keeping in mind that on some clays every patient really does say the same things, objective inductions will not be identical across her caseload. In contrast, subjective countertransference is uniform and repetitive. The analyst tends to have the same feelings towards a wide range of different patients. There will be some variability, of course. Some patients are more likely to arouse certain subjective issues rather than others, and there may be whole groups of patients that arouse a particular set of subjective issues in the analyst. But for the most part, subjective countertransference has a stereotypical quality that extends throughout the analyst's caseload. Most of the time, subjective countertransference feelings will be part of some discernible pattern from the analyst's life or character. Subjective feelings arise when the analyst feels something that is related primarily to her own life and not to the patient's life story, transference, or repetitions. The least analytically interesting forms of subjective countertransference are the thoughts and feelings that form the bulk of the analyst's stream of consciousness. Hunger, for example, is a common induction from patients who feel deprived, but sometimes it is nothing more than a reflection of the analyst's psychophysiological state at the moment. Similarly, many thoughts, feelings, and memories will have nothing to do with the patient. Although the analyst's reverie is usually an important source of information about the patient, Aga 1997a, some of it is just noise. More significant subjective countertransference arises when the patient does, or says something that triggers an emotional reaction in the therapist rooted in her history, but not in the patient's history. In one simple example, an analyst feared her rageful, violent father who had a bushy red beard. The analyst consequently feared an inhibited, shy patient who had a bushy red beard. The feeling was stimulated by the patient, but was not an induction. This type of subjective countertransference can arise from more deeply embedded issues as well. Conflicts the analyst experiences regularly with all or most patients, and usually in her personal life as well, are a common source. For example, the anticipation of raising fees used to be extremely difficult for me. There were times in my own analysis when I hated having my fee raised and anticipated that my own patients would respond the same way. In reality, some patients responded the way I expected, others had little or no trouble with fee increases, and some even welcomed it. Until I had resolved some of my subjective issues about fee increases, however, I anticipated the same reactions from every patient whenever the issue came up, regardless of how any particular patient might realistically be expected to react. More complex are the analyst's ongoing characterological traits: a need to compete with the successful, a desire to protect the abused, or a feeling of inferiority with the socially sophisticated. Any issue of this sort creates feelings about the patient that have nothing to do with the patient. Strongly held opinions of all sorts, especially those that have a pseudo-psychoanalytic foundation, such as prejudices around raising children, sexuality, or impulse control, can all be potent sources of subjective countertransference feelings. Another source of subjective countertransference feelings is the idiosyncratic aspects of the analyst's personality that place limitations on her ability to understand or accept the patient. Prejudices of any sort, ethnic, racial, religious, and diagnostic, e.g., a therapist who simply does not like and cannot tolerate drug addicts or child abusers, are common examples. One supervisee was unable to describe why she was so revolted by a new patient in the first session. We couldn't find any congruence in the material, nor did I have the same reaction to the patient. We considered the possibility that there was a difference in the type of countertransference that we were each experiencing, yet it did not ring true. After an extended discussion, she rather shamefully admitted that she had a profound disgust for Southerners, and this patient was from rural Alabama, white trash in her eyes. This appeared to be an example of a purely subjective countertransference in that no parallels to the material ever did turn up, and the feeling did not recur once the analyst's understanding of the patient as an individual predominated over her stereotypical response. Most of the time, these kinds of subjective feelings lose their intensity after they have been identified as such. At the other ankle of the tolerance spectrum, infatuations and idealizations can be a source of subjective distortion. An over-affection for artists, for example, can lead the analyst to miss the uniqueness of a particular patient who is an artist. These idiosyncratic aspects of the therapist's personality do not necessarily represent pathology. Indeed, Jacobson, 1964, argued that these types of quirks are vital to the functioning of a normal personality. But they do cloud the analyst's vision if she is not vigilant. Occasionally, the analyst experiences subjective countertransference feelings uniquely with one patient that are not part of a visible pattern in her life. While these feelings grow out of the analyst's history, they're derived from conflicts that the analyst is either unaware of or has dealt with very little. These are hard to sort out. Looking at the analyst's reactions to other patients will not clarify the situation. I know of no good way, or even a fairly reliable way, of determining whether a particular unique reaction is objective or purely subjective. The best way to begin is consultation with a supervisor, colleagues, or a supervisory group in order to see whether anyone shares the analyst's countertransference feelings. If so, the feeling is probably objective. If not, the consultant's reactions may still illuminate the situation, as it may further clarify the analyst's feeling and reveal areas of congruence that were not immediately obvious. If it is not possible to reach an understanding about the feelings, the only solution is to monitor them carefully. They do not usually cause problems in the treatment as long as the analyst remains conscious of them. Subjective distortions and misinterpretations of objective inductions. Even if the analyst experiences an objective countertransference feeling, subjective factors can cause her to misunderstand the meaning of the feeling. Induced boredom is a frequent example. Some analysts automatically assume that feeling bored means the patient is passive-aggressively killing them off. Others assume the patient is feeling depleted and helpless. Still others view it as a lack of engagement in the treatment process. Any of these interpretations of induced boredom might be correct. In the absence of more information that is based on a study of the content of the sessions, however, there is no way of knowing which one is correct. Each interpretation is valid as a hypothesis. As assumptions, however, they are subjective interpretations of objective countertransference. Objective countertransference can be misunderstood for characterological reasons. Every analyst has a subjective propensity to experience the patient within one object relational mode more readily than others, which colors her perception of the inductions. Analysts with looser ego boundaries tend to identify or merge with the patient. Consequently, they're more likely to assume the countertransference is narcissistic. Analysts with tighter ego boundaries, on the other hand, tend to experience the patient more readily as a separate object and to interpret the countertransference as being object or analytic. While no analyst I have ever met routinely experiences patients within the mode of projective identification, some are far more sensitive to it than others and interpret the countertransference more frequently in that direction. Objective inductions can also be misunderstood for theoretical reasons. Object relations theorists tend to interpret all countertransference as projective identification, interpersonalists and relationalists, to the extent that they use the concept of countertransference as object countertransference. Self-psychologists call the dimensions of it that they consider useful to be empathy, and modern analysts are pretty evenly split between those who experience every feeling as a narcissistic merger and those who see it all as the product of inhibited aggression against a frustrating person. Each orientation contains a measure of truth, but an exclusive adherence to any single one creates a disposition to misinterpret the raw emotional inductions in a doctrinaire way, causing the patient's communications to be co-opted by the analyst's worldview. The problem is more complex when the analyst not only misinterprets the induction, but also defensively transforms it into a different feeling because she is unable to tolerate it. This situation can quickly stalemate a case, even if the intolerance is not expressed overtly in the analyst's behavior. One supervisee said that his mind always wandered with a particular patient. It sounded as if he was dissociating. I asked what he could remember about what they discussed. It was always about extremely violent arguments between her and her mother. This was a point of subjective vulnerability for the analyst. The thought of the mother behaving viciously towards the patient made him extremely anxious. There was no indication that the patient was dissociating. She seemed to be fully immersed in her feelings. Once he became aware of this, he was able to be more present in the sessions, and he opened himself to the fear and the anxiety that the patient felt. Although there was no actual change in his overt interventions, after his emotional shift, she started to describe the fights and other aspects of the relationship in more nuanced detail. Intolerance of subjective or objective countertransference leading to errors in technique. So far, we have considered subjective countertransference as it is manifested only in the analyst's feelings, independent of the analyst's behavior. The situation is different when subjective countertransference feelings affect the analyst in ways that lead her to intervene in ways that are potentially disruptive or destructive to the process. Point 6. The relevant subjective factor here is not the countertransference feeling itself, which may be subjective or objective, but rather the inability to tolerate it while relating to the patient therapeutically. One supervisee had tremendous anxiety about feeling hate towards his patients, but was able to handle it if the patient was overtly aggressive. One patient, however, induced intense hatred at times when she was feeling helpless and passive. The supervisee responded by becoming excessively nice to her. This aggravated the situation immensely. The nicer he got, the more helpless and pathetic she became, and the case was stalemated. In supervision, he realized that he was afraid that he would lose control of his hatred if he did not act nice, and he was concerned that this would damage her. His concerns about hurting the patient were well-founded, but she didn't need him to be nice, either. The subjective element in the countertransference was not the anxiety, per se, which had both subjective and objective components, but the fact that it interfered with his ability to provide her with the right emotional climate in the session. After having discussed the problem, he became comfortable just feeling his hate, without being compelled to act on it or against it. They had a few sessions in which they both felt their feelings at full force, her helplessness and his hatred. Accurate emotional communication was restored in the analysis, and the case began to move again. In some cases, the analyst is conscious of both the intolerable feeling and its impact on her behavior. More often, the analyst is unconscious of both, only noticing when the treatment is obviously disturbed or when she does something so out of character that it jolts her into awareness. Impulsive interventions, particularly if the analyst is not usually impulsive, are a strong indication that the analyst is having trouble tolerating the countertransference. Other clues include spectacularly bad interventions that create a lot of disruption in the patient. Less spectacularly bad interventions that are made persistently, in spite of their ineffectiveness. Inflexibility or rigidity of any kind that is not typical of the analyst, needing to be right or needing to be understood, needing, as opposed to deciding, to be honest, sincere, authentic, making grand-sounding decisions to make significant changes in the treatment parameters, such as fees, attendance. or insurance, and giving ultimatums when they have not been carefully thought out. Mistakes of omission are also suggestive of an intolerance of the countertransference. Examples include not enforcing a rule or a policy, not asking a necessary question or avoiding a particular topic, not responding to a verbal or emotional contact, not changing the treatment when the patient gets worse, relying on routine interventions, even if they obviously aggravate the patient, starting late, ending early, inattention, falling asleep, or confusion. The list could go on, but the general rule is that any deviation from the way that the analyst usually functions, or any failure to deviate when it is clear that a deviation is necessary, should be examined to see whether the analyst is having trouble tolerating the countertransference feeling. No single act or lapse is conclusive. The analyst might have good reasons for doing most of the above, yes, even falling asleep. The issue is not what the analyst has done, but what motivates the analyst, and most importantly, to what degree the activity is under the analyst's conscious, or at least partially conscious, control. The more out of control it is, and the more repetitive it is, the more it is likely that subjective factors are at play. Subjective intolerance of the countertransference. There is one last type of situation that might be classified as a form of subjective countertransference that is better described as an inability to experience the countertransference. This occurs because the analyst does not have the emotional raw material within her experience to resonate with the patient's feelings. At times, this is because the analyst has not shared the patient's experience. For example, childless analysts sometimes have trouble empathizing with parents, probably because their own primary identification in life is still as a child, and there is not enough parental identification in their characters for them to be optimally responsive to a patient who is a parent. Cultural factors can come into play here as well, particularly in the area of culturally based religious or gender-related feelings. Finally, character styles are sometimes too different for the analyst to experience the feeling the patient is communicating. An analyst who is extremely easygoing and accepting, for example, may not be receptive to a patient who is raised in a rejecting environment and tries to induce rejecting feelings in the analyst. According to the dictum that was current in modern analytic circles when I first began my training, the analytic environment has to be similar enough to the original environment in order for it to be emotionally compelling, but different enough to be curative. Subjective unresponsiveness to the induction is problematic when the environment is not similar enough to be compelling. The effects of subjective countertransference on the treatment process. The effects of subjective countertransference on the treatment process vary considerably, depending on how strongly they are expressed in the analyst's behavior, how closely related they are to the analyst's core conflicts, and whether they are toxic to the patient. In general, subjective countertransference feelings, which are only minimally expressed through the analyst's behavior, have a negligible effect on the analytic process. Analysts can usually experience all sorts of subjective feelings that have no apparent impact on the treatment, provided the analyst can contain them well. Subjective misinterpretation of objective inductions is more problematic. The misunderstanding can lead to serious technical errors. If the analyst understands induced boredom as an effect of inhibited aggression when it is actually an expression of anechoic depression, she is likely to intervene, not just in the wrong way, but in exactly the wrong way. Even if the analyst does not make an intervention based on the misunderstanding, overcertainty about the meaning of an accurately experienced induction can create an atmosphere in the analysis in which the patient feels understood enough by the analyst to become not only extremely attached, but also hopeless about ever really getting through to her. I have found that cases in which the analyst accurately understands or sincerely tries to understand the patient's inductions flow much more quickly than those in which the analyst feels the inductions but weaves them into her own subjective agenda, even if this is not overtly expressed to the patient. The most technically complex situations occur when the analyst cannot tolerate the countertransference and consequently relates to the patient in ways that are actually or potentially disruptive to the treatment. Two main factors determine the successful resolution of this situation. The first is the degree to which the patient has been hurt by the analyst's out-of-control behavior. Most of the time, she is not hurt, or if she is, the damage is mild, and the patient and the analytic relationship are stronger from the challenge. But occasionally, and this is not always predictable, the patient has been so hurt by the analyst's behavior that the analysis cannot be saved. Of course, this is true of any incorrect intervention, but the stakes are higher when the analyst's behavior is even momentarily out of control. The second factor is the analyst's ability to control her behavior. This will depend to some degree on how deeply the loss of control is related to her core conflicts. But even when it is related to one of her entrenched conflicts, the analysis can still turn out well if the analyst is willing and able. It is hard to say which of these factors is more important. To work on tolerating the countertransference and changing the emotional climate in the analysis. The analyst may feel under less pressure in this regard if she remembers that she is not obliged to resolve the characterological issues involved in all areas of her life, just during the time that she is in session with the patient. The therapeutic results in these kinds of cases can be tremendous, often better than when the analyst tolerates the feeling as a matter of course, because the patient often knows and appreciates the work that the analyst has put into changing herself. The knowledge that the struggle was shared seems to increase the intensity of the benefits and gives the patient the unparalleled experience of having somebody important them change in order to meet her needs. On the other hand, the problems that arise when the analyst is unwilling or unable to learn to tolerate the countertransference can be profound. At the very least, the patient is limited in what she can accomplish with that particular analyst. If the feelings that the analyst cannot tolerate are unrelated to the patient's core problems, then the analysis can often proceed despite the analyst's limitations. While this is not ideal, it is not necessarily terrible. All patients need to learn how to live with situations in which their emotional needs are unmet because the person they are involved with cannot accommodate them. If the analyst can help the patient to do this in the analysis, this too can be an aspect of analytic growth. However, if the analyst's problems are central to what the patient needs to work through in order to mature and get on with her life, then the problem is serious. At times, the patient can work around the analyst's limitation and resolve the issue on her own. This is a little bit like what occurs when a child is able to mature beyond her parents need to hold her back in a particular area. More often, the patient needs to get another analyst, either instead of or in addition to the current one. Group therapy, sometimes with the same analyst, sometimes with another, is another possible solution. This again is an unfortunate situation, but it need not be tragic, provided the analyst can face it without a wardrobe of excuses on 1979, 92, and help the patient get what she needs elsewhere. While most analysts would probably like to help all of their patients through all phases of their development, this is an outlandish expectation. All analyses, even the most experienced and well-analyzed, have areas of subjective vulnerability. There are always limits to what one patient can accomplish with a particular analyst. The real trouble starts when the analyst cannot tolerate the feelings but proceeds as if everything were fine, or worse, blames the patient when there are problems. The emotional atmosphere in the analysis becomes increasingly contaminated by the analyst's own repetitions. The other types of subjective countertransference, experiencing feelings unrelated to the patient's life story and misinterpretation of the induced feelings, proliferate wildly as the analyst hardens in her resistance to tolerating the countertransference and changing her behavior. These are the kinds of situations that give analysis a bad name. They can be extremely damaging to the patient and can eventually corrode the analyst's integrity in her work with other patients as well. The best prevention for this sort of thing is ongoing supervision, preferably with ongoing personal analysis as well. But alas, even that does not provide complete protection. Every analyst must engage in ongoing self-monitoring and self-reflection, especially at times when the going is rough in the treatment and the analyst finds that she is becoming increasingly vehement and inflexible in her responses. Conclusion. Differentiating objective from subjective countertransference involves comparing the analyst's countertransference to the content of the session for as long as necessary in order to find consistencies between the analyst's feelings and the patterns within the story of the patient's life. In order to do this, the analyst must be willing and able to allow herself to experience the full range of her feelings in relationship to the patient, without regard to whether they first appear to be important or trivial, professional or unprofessional, empathic or malevolent. Only when she can experience all of her feelings in relationship to the patient can she abstract the patterns that will elucidate the repetitions that constrict the patient's life. The goal here has been beautifully described by Spotnitz, 1985, 247, as the freedom to function. This is the state in which the analyst has acquired the freedom and the strength to feel the full range of her feelings towards the patient while maintaining the ability to do the right thing, to see the transference and the countertransference clearly, co-intervene with whatever techniques or emotional communications are required, and to not intervene when no intervention is necessary. While no analyst can possibly meet Kai's goal all the time, It remains a practical point of reference and an admirable goal co-attempt co-achieve.